Hello and welcome to this episode of Political Debrief. I'm your host, Joshua Oliverio. Around the world, we've been talking about climate change and its impacts that it's leaving on the planet. Today, I want to talk about the impact that climate change is having on the ski and snowboard season across Canada. Ali Wines is the Executive Director of Protect Our Winters Canada, an organization dedicated to climate action advocacy, specifically around the winter sports. We had a great chat and I'm excited to share it with you now. All right, and I'm joined now by Ali Wines. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
So let's start with an introduction of yourself and then we'll get into talking about what Protect Our Winters is all about. So do you want to just give a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Ali Wines. I'm the Executive Director at Protect Our Winters Canada. You can probably hear that it's not a Canadian accent. I actually grew up in Australia, grew up in Melbourne. I was a skier up around a couple of hours north of Melbourne, grew up skiing around there, which sort of developed my love of winter. And we moved to Canada 6 years ago, and I got involved with Protect Our Winters right away, initially as a volunteer, helping with developing the strategy and supporting some of the events that we did as chapters were trying to get off the ground here in Toronto. And I've been in the executive director role for coming up to a year now.
So, Protect Our Winters. What is Protect Our Winters? What is the goal that Protect Our Winters has set?
Yeah, great question. Our goal is to unite the outdoor community in the fight against climate change. And where our thinking comes from is that other groups are incredibly well organized. And you see a lot of lobbying from, for example, the oil and gas companies. They're united, they have groups that they operate through. But the outdoor economy in Canada is absolutely huge. And we know that 75% of Canadians engage in outdoor and wilderness activities every year. There are so many of us that spend time in nature and want to protect it, but haven't always felt like there's an avenue or a channel for them to be able to do that. So POW aims to be that voice and that channel for people who care about the places that we love to recreate.
So when I was on your website doing some research for this interview, I came across your alliances. And I think that that's what you're talking about when it comes to those partnerships, if I'm not mistaken. So some of those partnerships that you're working with include like ski and snow resorts, working with the actual athletes, scientists, creatives, and retailers as well. Why is it so important to have all these people coming together?
That's a really great question. I think because we know that the outdoor community isn't just one group of people. It doesn't look just a certain way. So yes, there are thousands, probably millions of Canadians who are outdoor recreationalists. But when you can start incorporating things like our brand partners who include Arc'teryx, MEC, the North Face, some really big, well-known brands across the country and internationally, it carries some weight. So not only do they support our work, but when we go and do lobbying trips to Ottawa, for example, being able to have the support either in presence or implied of these organizations really helps with making an impact from a lobbying perspective, because all of a sudden you have MPs realizing that here's a group of organizations that contribute billions of dollars collectively to the Canadian economy and employ tens of thousands of people across the country. So that's incredibly important from a partnership perspective. And then when you think about the athletes, here are people that millions of people look up to. They're out there, they're doing rad stuff in the mountains. They have huge platforms on Instagram and all of the other social channels that they're part of. People admire and respect them and they listen to what they have to say. So it's really about kind of making climate action cool. It's something that we should all be into, but sometimes I think in the past it's had a bit of a reputation of being a little bit, a bit dowdy maybe, for lack of a better word, not fun. And we aim to counter that. We want to make climate action cool, but also fun and something that's engaging for people to participate in as well.
So let's talk about the situation now in general. You live in Toronto. I live about an hour west of Toronto. And where I live, our local ski club that is normally open either just after New Year's or just before New Year's opened in about mid-January, and the conditions were not very good. Now we've got a whole lot of snow now. It's gone better. But presumably these are impacts of climate change. Do you think that that's why part of the reason why you've been able to get these, snow resorts on board is because it's impacting their bottom line as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think our resort partners really see that their businesses are completely tied to the well-being of our snow seasons. And anyone who spends time in the snow or, outdoors in winter can see that the changes are taking place pretty rapidly in our lifetimes. And that's backed up by many, many scientific studies. Our Science Alliance, which you mentioned earlier, has produced a report called Losing Our Cool, which touches on what the impacts will be for ski seasons going forward if we don't meet our climate agreements in Canada. So, yeah, I think it's a pretty pressing and top of mind challenge for everybody.
The goal with this podcast is to talk about the issues in Canadian politics and how it affects Canada's youth. And this is a pretty big issue across Canada, but also specifically when it comes to, the work that Protect Our Winters does. I think that it's really important to young people. How is your organization reaching out to young people and getting them involved?
Yeah, I think young people are incredibly important to protect our winters. A lot of other environmental organizations tend to have demographics kind of in the older generations, 50, 60 plus, and Protect Our Winters tends to be a lot closer to our main group is aged between 18 and 40, but we have members, I think, as young as 8 and probably right up the other end of the spectrum as well. So in our mind, we really see the youth as the driving force between the changes that really need to happen over the coming years. And although a lot of younger people aren't able to vote yet, they're still incredibly influential in terms of the conversations they have with the people around them. I think you only need to look at the Fridays for Future marches to see that, young people are really driving social change in a meaningful way. And so, we have programs where we go out to schools. Our Hot Planet Cool Athletes program sends athletes into schools to talk about climate change and to directly talk to young people about the influence that they can have, even if they're not able to put their name on a ballot paper just yet.
And so, how do you think that young people can be part of the solution? Do you think that there is part of the solution that young people can play? And I'm sorry if this is like a duplicate question from what I asked before. Do you think that there's room in the solution as well that young people can play a part in?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think just it's interesting that research shows that the most effective thing that any individual can do, regardless of their age, is to have a conversation about climate change. There's so much pressure to drive an electric car or become vegan or all those other sort of individual actions that do add up in the aggregate. But the most powerful thing is just having those conversations. And I think that's something that, young people now are so much better educated on climate than any other generation that's come before them. So seeing themselves as having some power and agency with that education to talk to people around them is hugely, hugely important.
So, Protect Our Winters Canada has some policy initiatives. There's 4. They are carbon pricing, renewable energy, sustainable finance, and nature-based climate solutions. If it's okay with you, I'd like to go into each one in a little bit more detail. And so let's start with carbon pricing. Do you think that because we have a carbon tax in Canada, do you think that do you think that first of all, I guess I'd ask, do you think that the current carbon pricing structure goes far enough?
We think so. We've just restructured those impact areas actually because we looked at the carbon pricing topic and thought that we've probably made enough progress in that area that we can now redirect our attention to other places that we see gaps. But I think the increasing carbon floor that the federal government has currently set is really positive. I know there's resistance to that creeping up over time, But I think it just becomes a part of the cost of doing business, the cost of living in a fossil fuel based economy that will help to drive that fossil fuel usage down over time. So yeah, we're very supportive of that.
And so let's talk a little bit about renewable energy now, because this, right, we've been talking about renewable energy for a while, phasing out those fossil fuels and bringing in more clean, renewable energy sources. I guess my question is more directed at those resort partners again. Do you think that they are, I guess, pulling their weight in terms of switching to these renewable energy sources? Or do you think that there's more work to be done there?
I think yes. I think the intention is absolutely there. A lot of them can be hamstrung by what the services are around them. So if they're operating in an area that doesn't have a particularly clean grid, that can be challenging. Some things like snowcats tend to be the biggest source of carbon emissions for ski resorts. And so those grooming activities, until there's really solid technology to bring in electric snow groomers, that is going to continue to be a source of emissions for them. But a lot of them are aware of that, and they're working to really reduce their footprint in other areas where they can, whether that's reducing water usage, thinking about ways to bring more electrification into snowmaking systems. A lot, for example, Cypress Mountain has a huge electric windmill on top generating some power. So a lot of them are kind of making the steps where they're able to. And that's what we really encourage at Power. It's really about progress over perfection. We know nobody's going to be, flawless overnight. None of us are. But it's about taking those small steps that make it better every day.
And how do you find that the retailers play a role in this? How are the retailers helping protect our winters, achieve their goals?
For us, it's really about brand awareness. So we find that we have a really strong base in Western Canada. Most people tend to know who Protect Our Winters is. It's kind of a cool brand to be associated with. People like wearing a Power hoodie. It's less so out east. So we try and work with our retailers to just get the brand out there, to educate their staff, to talk a little bit about POW, try and encourage people who are shopping in store to make sustainable choices and to think about their role as having an impact on climate, but becoming climate activists as well.
So then would you say that that's kind of the big goal for POW right now, is to expand into like eastern areas of Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. We really, one of the things that we're incredibly aware of is that the more members we have, the easier it is to show up to Ottawa or to show up to a provincial parliament and to be heard, because the MPs and MPPs recognise that we're representing a larger number of their constituents. So it's kind of a numbers game. And that's a really big goal for us, just to make sure that, we can boost those numbers, particularly here in the East, so that we can be more impactful across the board.
So let's talk a little bit about that action that you're doing, or those, involvement in that involvement that you have on Parliament Hill now. What types of steps, like what are you doing to increase awareness of the issue with federal politicians?
We have some really good relationships with federal politicians in Ottawa. So it's taken us a little while. I think government relations is a bit of a long game. So we've spent a lot of time just going to Ottawa, meeting with people, trying to help them to draw the connection between people who like to get outside and go hiking or skiing or paddling or whatever it might be, and the number of people who are deeply concerned about the climate crisis. And I think, we're at a point now where we're starting to see those light bulbs go off and people are interested to have conversations with us. And I think a big part of that is we're a different kind of climate organisation. When we show up with athletes who are telling stories about how their training and competitions have been impacted by climate change, that makes a really compelling story for people to listen to. So we always try and show up with an ask or a story, to help the politicians understand that, we want them to take action on a particular issue, whether that's, most recently we were looking at biodiversity, pushing for federal biodiversity legislation, which was announced back in December. That was a great win. through to investing more in renewables, putting more in the budget, or putting a cap on oil and gas emissions. There's a number of things that we try to show up with and be specific about what we're asking for.
So then what would you say are some of your biggest wins that you've had working with these politicians and, the biggest wins that you've had in general?
Probably our biggest and most notable was the GNL pipeline that was slated to be laid through Quebec and through the Saguenay Fjord, which was going to be hugely detrimental from a biodiversity perspective, from an emissions perspective, from an outdoor recreation perspective. It was going to cross numerous Indigenous territories against the wishes of the First Nations people whose land that is. So we really put up a big fight about that. It was something we were able to mobilise on really quickly. We worked together with a number of other climate organisations to put together a big campaign asking the Quebec government to reject that pipeline. And thanks to a really significant amount of public pressure, not just from us, but from many organisations, that pipeline was dropped. And that was a huge win, I think.
We're kind of moving around here in the interview a little bit, but let's talk a little bit about the international role that Protect Our Winters has, because there's Protect Our Winters Canada, but then there's also other, I guess we'll call them sections of Protect Our Winters all across the world. For example, you've got groups in Finland, Austria, the UK, Australia, where you're from. How does POW Canada contribute to the greater Protect Our Winters community?
It's a really interesting relationship. So POW was founded in 2007 in the US. It was founded by professional snowboarder Jeremy Jones, who had traveled the world and seen the changes before his eyes and seen that not only were we losing snow in resort areas, but that backcountry travel was becoming increasingly unsafe. Just moving through the mountains required so much more navigation and planning because of the changing conditions. So they existed for about 10 years, and POW Canada was founded coming up to 5 years ago now. And although we share a brand and we share a name, we're actually unrelated organizations. So we try and work together closely and make sure that we're kind of sharing a mission and vision and sharing resources where that's possible. But because each of the POW chapters operates in pretty different political climates and environments, we tend to each do our own thing because our priorities are naturally going to be a little bit different as well.
My last question for you today: if you had to go back to when you were 14 or 15, is there a piece of advice that you give yourself?
Oh, that's a great question. So many. I think it would be to listen to your gut. So my background is I actually studied law as my first degree, and I practiced for a couple of years before going into management consulting. And I think I felt a lot of pressure from the people around me to do a high-level degree because I got good grades at school, and to have a very kind of corporate traditional career that would set me up for kind of economic stability and success. And I gained a lot from that in terms of experience, but I was in no way passionate about it. And I spent a lot of years feeling quite lost and not wanting to show up in my career as much as I should because I just didn't have that purpose or passion. So I would say really take some time to listen to your gut and think about what matters to you and what contribution you want to make as an individual.
And with that, Ellie Weitz, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh. That was fun.
And that's it for this episode of Political Debrief. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I would invite you to subscribe to Political Debrief on all your favorite podcast platforms and on YouTube to get an alert whenever a new episode is posted. As well, you can follow me on Twitter at Joshua Oliverio and the show on Instagram at Political Debrief Show. And consider subscribing to our email list to get an alert every time we post a new episode, as well as some exclusive content. Thanks so much again for listening, and I look forward to the next episode, which should come out in a couple of weeks' time.